The funny thing is, Simon, you said earlier on that in some of the case studies you showed where things went horribly wrong, you pointed out that they had misunderstood certain parts. But what's the bet? The people who wrote the feasibility studies and the pre-feasibility study didn't think they'd misunderstood anything. They probably thought they were really on the money. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone ahead to the stages that they did. So fair to say that there were certain gaps in the understanding rather than them knowingly misunderstanding.
Look, good point, Mark. And look, I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been consulting for the last 7.5 years. Prior to that, I had 24 building and operating mines. One of the risks that you get when you are engaged in these studies is you can get very close to it. And when you get so close to it, you can become a bit blind and ignore some of the things which to an outsider are very obvious, but you can skate over, and that can introduce holes in the study. Coming back to a lot of the examples Mark gave was about the peer review process. And this is where, as a governance process for doing studies, you can come in and you can bring these peer review processes in to bring in an external, a third set of eyes in to examine what the project team have been done and to potentially identify things that we as a project team have missed because we've just been too close to it. And I've been in that situation before.
And challenged assumptions and all of those things. So fair to say that in the case studies you showed, that peer review failed, or there wasn't one to begin with.
There wasn't one as a continuum throughout the study process, or it came too late, or not at all.
Right. Do we have any questions?
So I want to ask whether do you reconcile your assurance with the actual results subsequently?
So as you work through a project, obviously from estimation of the resource to reserve to actual production, the next R in the resource reserve continuum is reconciliation. And the proof of the actual success of the project is that final reconciliation. So once a company begins producing, there is an obligation and an expectation under, for example, the JORC code or any other, that there's reconciliation against prediction. And many public reports, so annual reports, for example, by the mining companies, will include a section in their resource reserve section over reconciliation. And some are very, very detailed. If you read, for example, the Anglo-American annual report for resource reserves, you'll see long, detailed, very detailed sections on reconciliation movements. So very important.
But embedded in that question is how accurate do the reports turn out to be, right? And
so that's your question. How good are they? So, I mean, Simon spoke about studies and study outcomes, but in terms of resource and reserve reporting, it is a process of continual improvement. So you're monitoring, you're modifying factors that go in. So, for example, resource to reserves about mining loss, dilution, extraction. And generally, they stack up moderately well because they become self-learning over the years. The more they learn, the more they should apply them back to their process. And so the closer they should get.
Hi, good afternoon, gentlemen. Okay, I wish to ask two questions. Number one is, you keep mentioning Rio Tinto. I think is a great mining company in Australia. How about BHP Billiton, which is also the world number one? I'd like to hear your view. Number two question.
Sorry, which company?
BHP
Billiton, right.
Then the other question would be, I think some years back, Shell reported that their reserves were actually not accurate, and there are some measures taken. Probably I wish to hear your expert opinion on this matter. Thank you.
Look, so for background, I spent the immediate 10 years before I joined SRK, I worked for Rio Tinto globally in South Africa, Australia, USA. You specifically asked about BHP. So whether it's BHP or Glencore or any of those other big sort of tier one, they're all much of a muchness. I just sort of paint a broad sort of picture there. They all mine multiple commodities and they mine in multiple places around the world. So from a technical perspective, they all do roughly the same thing. There are different ways that they operate, and Mark alluded to some of that in his presentation where he quoted some examples from the governance sort of process there. But, you know, those are quite subtle differences often, and you've got to know a lot about the companies and drill into the companies in detail to understand where they are. But simple answer, they're broadly the same. Dropping down into Mark asked about the smaller companies. Again, that they can be very good in their own right. You don't have to be a huge thing to be, the best. You can be small and niche and do work properly, like I saw in this Asian country that I quoted you the example on of the polymetallic mine. Often the rate determining the rate determining step to successful outcome is the people. I come back to my saying before, people make the difference. And I've had the privilege of working around the world a lot and meeting a lot of different people, and the most successful operations that I've seen are the ones that have the best people that do the right thing. They want to do what they're doing for the right reason.
Okay. And I think the other question was in relation to how Shell back in 2004, in fact January the 9th, 2004, Shell announced that their reserves were 20% less than they had previously disclosed. And in essence, well, I realize this is an oil industry conversation rather than one that you're involved in the mining industry. I guess the concern similarly is that companies that had previously said we're very sure of what our proven reserves are, how often do they then go through the process of reassessing and checking again and then saying, yeah, actually, it's actually 20% less. These are just probable.
So I can't comment specifically on the Shell topic, but over the last several years, when commodity prices fell drastically or exchange rates changed, a number of companies did not revisit their reserve statements immediately. And so over a couple of years, it became apparent that if they applied the new assumptions on long-term pricing and or long-term exchange rates, some of what they reported as reserves would no longer be reserves. And a number of companies over the past several years, it took them a little while to realize this wasn't a short-term change in the market. These were fundamental, longer-term changes, began reassessing their reserves. So you ended up having a number of write-downs or restatements or reassessments through different companies who realized, because for example, the JORC code has a discussion there about it's not intended that you change your reserve estimate for short-term fluctuations. It needs to be something long-term sustainable that you can point to. The question is, when do you make that decision? So a question internally with the company is, what has their process been to assess the input assumptions that drive their reserve determining? Because the important thing with a technical study as well, like Simon's been doing, a pre-feasibility or a feasibility study is only valid at the time the assumptions were made and the report was generated. So when things are changing rapidly in the world, you always need to look at the date stamp on that study. Were the reserves correct at the time of reporting with this set of assumptions? Because when things are changing rapidly over the past 5 years in pricing or etc., many banks and lenders would only give for example, a feasibility study a 6-month to 12-month life, after which they would question the input assumptions because they change and could change the output.
In terms of risk level for different type of deposit, for example, oil, coal, gold mine, in terms of CapEx or exploration, the accuracy and the processing, which one is having more risk and how you rank them?
In other words, is there a mineral that is easier to assess the risk of more accurately? Is that your question?
Which one will involve more risk? Like for example, let's say coal, in the exploration stage, where you determine the resource and how accurate they are, and comparing with gold mine, comparing with diamond. No?
Yes, he's asking, is there a surefire win in the mining industry?
No. And I can say that from personal investment experience and professionally as a mining engineer.
But is there something that comes closer than other minerals?
Look, You know, it depends is the answer. And I'm not saying this
Do
is
you know how often we've heard that phrase on this
is
stage?
the answer, but in the game we're in the resource game that we're in, every deposit is unique. There's no one that's the same that you can take a cookie cutter and say, I'm going to do it like this and like this and like this. They all vary enormously. And again, I stand by my slide there. It's getting more complex with time. So you've got to look and see what's unique about, and maybe in one project, the geological setting is very unique. And you've got to do a lot of work to understand it, like the platinum mine I worked at in South Africa. And you need to understand how this ore body is dipping. Others I see these days, the metallurgy, so how the mineralization is made up, and do you need a special process to release it? So it mightn't just be an ordinary gold separation where some of it comes out by gravity and some of it comes out by cyanidation. You need to use a very technical acid leaching for some commodities I've seen. There is no one cookie cutter answer. You've got to look at each on its own merits and decide where the key levers are and do less or more work on each of them.
Okay, but still, just to try to get a more definitive answer for you, is there such a thing as a Christmas cookie where you'd say, okay, generally speaking, when we talk about iron ore, let's just say, it's easier to identify, to put your finger on the facts, and therefore less risky compared to other minerals, which I think is at the heart of this question?
Look, broadly speaking, the bulk commodities, so by bulk I mean things like iron ore, coal, bauxite, mineral sands, those things that are in large volumes, wherever they are typically easier to work through than some of the smaller niche commodities.
Like silver, gold, platinum?
Yeah, let's get a good example is rare earths. Okay, something that's very complex, the way it forms in the ground, and even more complex to release with a processing method. That would be the easy stuff, would be the bulks, the iron ore and coal, say, on the left-hand side. The much, much harder stuff would be, say, rare earths.
For small mines, they may not have technical expertise like yours in-house. So would it be fair to say that a typical scenario of a niche small mine operation, they would send borings and then send it to consultants like yourself to assess the reserves? And would this process satisfy the requirement of the government just outlined?
So I guess there's two questions. It's as a small operator, do you need that additional layer of assurance? It depends on where your money comes from. So if you're self-funding, for example, you're willing to take your own risks. But if you lend in money or have external investors, then it's normally those people who are looking for assurance. If you're self-funding, you can take whatever risk you like, is one part. And the other part is we often find that companies, for example, I said, if a company has few people or less experienced people, but recognizes that and has some system of mentoring or peer review or review, then that can actually help manage that risk profile and provide learning. So in your instance, for example, we see the same, right now where a company has people doing the work, they're not quite competent to do the work entirely on their own. And so if they don't have internal reviewers or mentors, they go externally to get them in order to improve the way they do their work. So that's not unusual. The question is whether you want the people who are external to sign off as competent persons for public reporting. So again, it's what's the purpose? Do you want to publish your resource reserve publicly, in which case you need a competent person? And if the internal person is not a competent person for that purpose, so it's really why you need it, then yes, you could go external and have somebody external do it for you. But I think you have to decide why you need it done. So that's not uncommon in small companies that they basically outsource or use those people as consultants or contractor to do that work. But often we find that one of the areas that we find becomes more difficult to assess is the data collection, the data inputs, because often that's been collected by the people on site. So what you find that those external people have difficulty with or have to spend more time on is going back to the people on site to say, how did you collect the information? How did you analyze the samples? Because those are your inputs. Remember, in the JORC reporting, the first section of Table 1 is about how did you sample? Where did the data come from? What's the reliability of input data? So one has to work very carefully with where did the data come from rather than simply using the data. So two parts to it. And that's often where we have to use rely on the internal people who did the work and help guide them in terms of how do you assess the accuracy and reliability of the data that you then want the external people to use. So it comes down to competence. Who's competent for what part of the process? And you might have internal people who are quite competent for parts of the process.
Or you might not, and I guess that's the point of the question, isn't it? That can small companies simply abrogate this responsibility to a third party? I thought on one of your slides it says that management has to be, the buck has to first stop at management and the consultants only came third in line. That was your chart, right? So can the management just say, sorry, we're a small company, but we hired SRK and they've done a great job? Is that possible?
Yeah, so if you don't have internal competent persons to actually do the work and the estimation and the reporting, then sure, you would engage people. But as Simon said, don't leave it too late. It's not a rubber stamp exercise. The people who sign off as competent persons have to be comfortable and place reliance on the information they're reporting. So it's basically working as a partnership rather than as an external rubber stamp.
Okay.
So my slide was about reviewing and auditing,
Yes.
rather than that. Remember that practitioner level of
Yes.
where the work gets done at stage 1. Those might be external people as well if you don't have a competency.
Okay, so, but when our guests here today front up at AGMs, they look at the reports and the disclosures to the exchange, and they then have the CEO or the chairman or somebody saying, yeah, sorry, I can't tell you anything about the report. You're going to have to talk to our consultants. Is that an acceptable answer?
If I were a director or senior management of the company, I would expect to know as much about the work that was done by my external suppliers as my internal suppliers, because that's your responsibility as a director of the company.
So the answer is no, you can't take that as an answer. Simon, you were going to jump in?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to add another thought on the juniors. Sometimes the juniors don't, or one of the problems I see crops up from probably more often than you'd like is that the juniors aren't really knowing what they want in the first place. And therefore, when it comes to do they get internal resources to do things or do they get external consultants to come and do things, the first question that they need to answer to themselves is, what do I want? So one of the things you've got to be careful with the junior companies is, have they actually answered that question first? Have they worked out in their mind internally, strategically, what it is that they want to do and want to achieve ultimately? And therefore, are they going to man it up internally, or do they need external help depending on what they end up wanting? So you just got to be careful with that as well.
What about from the perspective of an investor? I mean, like what you have just said, you go to AGM, you see, you can rely on the JORC report and all those things. What does it mean? You know, does it meet the high requirement that you have set out in the governance process? As an investor, how do we know?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, Simon, in this part of the world, we just look at the report and firstly, whether it's been done. Second, we look at how many pages there are. And third, if there are things that have lots of text, then there must be problems. Is that a good rule of thumb to go into reading one of these reports with?
It's sort of like somebody used to say when I was at school, if you chuck an essay down or you have a pile of essays that have been written by all the students, you stand at the top of the stairs and throw them down. The heaviest one, the one with the most pages, wins. But Look, part of it is brand, and some companies or consultancies have a better brand, so you can use that as a judgment tool to work out who's done it. And the other thing is transparency. Now, as Mark said, under the SGX, you fall under the JORC guidelines here. You'll find in Australia, a lot of the companies are becoming a lot more transparent with publishing the technical studies on their websites, so that you as an investor can go and now read, you can download a PFS or an FS study from the company's website and read it for yourself. If it's a well-done PFS or FS done by a reputable company, you'll very quickly see the quality in it and be able to come to your own conclusions. But the thing I'd look for as a rough guideline is how transparent is the company. If the company is reluctant to publish their studies, that's maybe a bit of a warning bell. If they are very open, as a lot I'm seeing more and more in Australia where they publish all the studies, that would be a good sign, because you could have an increasing level of trust for that.
And from my talk, and do they have an assurance process where basically there have been independent reviews or audits that they refer to on that study or report? So that becomes really important, that they've had a series of checks or balances on their own report. So you as an external reader don't just have to rely on the primary author. There's been another set of reviews by a reputable person and or companies.
I'd like to add one thought as a journalist, and that is that often it's after you ask the third question, if you still get a sensible answer, then they might probably know what they're talking about. If they're trying to get rid of you after the first or second question because they're impatient or they don't know the detail, they don't actually know what's in the report, they can't explain it to you, then that also is an indication of whether or not you want to go further.
But remember, a director of a company, whether they're technical, if they're a director of a company that's a resource reserve or mining company, it's their obligation as directors to understand as best as they can the purpose and nature of their business and their financial reports, which rely on technical data. So they don't need to be technical experts, but they sign off that the information is fair, correct, reasonable, and they may need to place reliance on someone else who they've engaged as an advisor to provide them with that assurance.
Yes.